Welcome to episode 66 of the MMA Rundown podcast. We just had UFC 251 finish up last night, and there were three title fights on the card, so I'll make sure to recap all of them. So the first one to talk about, obviously, is going to be the main event. That was between Kamaru Usman and Jorge Masvidal. Usman was able to get the win there by a fairly boring, grinding decision. The fight before that was between Max Holloway and Alexander Volkanovski. Another really competitive fight between the two of them. This one was more competitive than the first. At the end of 5 rounds, I think a lot of people had assumed that Holloway had done enough, especially in the early rounds, to get the win here. Unfortunately, he loses by split decision, so I'll talk about that decision, talk about the fight as a whole, and then what's next for both of these guys. We've got Petr Yan versus Jose Aldo fighting for the bantamweight title. This was also an excellent fight, especially from Aldo's end. It's been a long time since we've seen him throw this many leg kicks and even body kicks to that end. A lot more kicks out of him. It was sort of like a vintage Aldo to an extent, but Yan was able to weather the storm early and eventually get him out of there in the 5th round, so I'll talk about that. Recap the rest of the card for UFC 230 or UFC 251, and then preview a couple of upcoming UFC cards. So there's going to be the one that's coming up on Wednesday, July 15th, so I'll preview that card. And then the card that'll be coming next Saturday as well. I think it's just going to be UFC Fight Island 2 and UFC Fight Island 3 in terms of what they're called, but I'll be previewing both of them. Talk about a really weird situation that happened in wrestling where Pat Downey, a name who I'm sure has come up a bunch over the last year, got kicked out of his wrestling club over a tweet that he made that it really didn't seem like it was really worth him getting kicked out of his club for. So I'll talk about that whole situation and his response to it, including him saying that this is why he thinks that wrestling's a dying sport and why he's going to be going to fighting pretty soon and moving over to MMA, which will be really exciting because for one, he's got a great wrestling background, but for two, a great personality. So if he can actually have some success in the cage, he's a guy who could potentially become a future star in MMA. And it seems as though the events of yesterday are going to push him in that direction. Even faster. And then the last thing to talk about is going to be Jiu-Jitsu recap for Third Coast Grappling. They had another one of their kumites. A lot of really good matches on it. Roberto Cyborg Abreu ended up winning it all, so I'll just go through all the matches on that as well. So from the start, we got Kamaru Usman versus Jorge Masvidal. And this fight, to an extent, it's not as though it was surprising how it went. But with that being said, it was pretty disappointing in that it felt like there was a lot of hype heading into this fight. If Masvidal was able to get a dominant win here, that his star could explode and he could become a big superstar for the UFC. If Usman were to get a really good win on his end, then he can sort of steal the luster. We all remember that before the Khabib and Conor fight, a lot of MMA fans were very well aware of who Khabib was. But to the casual fan, he wasn't really huge yet. He was pretty big in Russia, but internationally he wasn't huge. And then he puts on a fantastic performance against Conor McGregor, and he just becomes a superstar off of that, even to an extent with Masvidal. Ben Askren had drawn a lot of attention to himself, and then for Masvidal to beat him and beat him the way he did, was able to build a lot of stardom off of that. So there was kind of this hope where it's like if Masvidal gets a dominant win, then he just moves into the next stratosphere and becomes an even bigger star. But if Usman gets a really good win, then he can take some of that luster and become a star himself. And unfortunately, the way this fight worked out, it didn't help Masvidal to lose the way that he did at all. But for Usman to win the way that he did, I don't really think that a lot of people are going to be dying to see Usman's next fight either, which is unfortunate because it's not as though Usman only gets in boring fights. He gets in a lot of boring fights, but his last fight with Colby Covington was not a boring fight. It was a fantastic fight. So he does have good fights in him. It's just that Masvidal wasn't able to draw that out of him. And a big reason why was that for Kamaru Usman, or if you're fighting Kamaru Usman, the worst possible place you can find yourself is up against the fence because he's got really long punches. He's really good at mixing up punches and also like shooting and then going for takedowns. So if you get caught up against the fence, it's going to be tough to get out of there. And in all likelihood, you're going to take a big shot or you're going to end up getting wrestle-fucked. And in this case, Masvidal had a bit of both, but it was a lot more of him getting wrestle-fucked up against the fence. And a big reason why the Colby fight was not like this is Colby was constantly fighting for the center and constantly keeping himself away from the fence. And that forced Usman to have a more exciting fight. There were a couple moments where Usman did shoot in the middle of the cage, which isn't necessarily something that you see a lot from him. Early on, he caught a kick and was able to get a takedown off of that. But he was also shooting early on and sort of had some mixed success with that. So the hope would have been for this fight, especially with it being in a 35-foot cage, or I think it's 35 feet. I don't remember if it's feet or yards. It's got to be feet. Either way, in the big cage, you would have figured that Masvidal, having that extra space, would be able to stay off the fence, and as a result, would be able to make this fight more exciting and have this fight in positions where he wanted it. But unfortunately for him, he was spending a little bit too much time on his back foot, too much time trying to read and counter against Usman, and that's just ultimately not a great way to go about fighting him. So, though he had his moments, though he landed some pretty decent shots, Masvidal wasn't ever really able to drop Usman or to really stun him that badly. Usman wasn't able to do major damage on Masvidal either. A lot of the work that he had was up against the fence. And sort of a separate thing that is worth mentioning with this fight. And I guess you can kind of blame all three guys in the octagon for why this fight was so boring. So for Kamaru Usman, once he got the fight up against the fence and was able to control Masvidal, he chose not to really work that hard for takedowns and then try to pass guard and try to work into finishing positions once he got on the ground. He also chose not to separate and create space for him to land heavier shots for the most part. So to that end, you got to give Kamaru Usman some blame for this fight being as boring as it was. For Jorge Masvidal, him not being able to exit those clinch exchanges and get out and get free, and also him being up against the fence as much as he was and having his back to the fence as much as it was, that's on him, and that's part of the reason why this fight was so boring. But another part of it is also the ref and Mark Goddard, who occasionally would make some warnings, but really didn't do a whole lot to separate these guys up against the fence. And ultimately, there's a few different ways to look at this. Like, I was talking to one of my friends while I was watching this, and he was saying he kind of views himself as more of a purist, where he doesn't like the idea of refs stepping in and stopping a fight and stopping action, that he wants fighters to have to earn their way back to neutral positions. And that's a fair way to look at it. I don't know that he's wrong at all. I know I would say in most combat sports there are passivity penalties. There are times where you'll have to reset a fight because of passivity, and with this being a combat sport, there was definitely large moments of passivity in there for Usman. I think when you're judging a fight, and then also when you're reffing a fight, what you're looking to see is you're looking to see a fighter continually make progress towards a finish. And in the case of having someone up against the cage, you can do that by creating a little bit of space and laying some heavy knees, some heavy elbows. So you can try to look for a knockout up against the fence. You can try to actively fight for a takedown so you can get the fight to the ground, so then you can then progress on the ground, whether it's progressing to a position where you can land some heavy ground and pound and get a finish that way, whether you're progressing towards a position where you are in a better position to get a submission. That's ultimately what you're trying to do in a fight. And with Usman, for much of the time he was up against the fence, he was making no real effort to try to take Masvidal down. There were times when he did go for takedowns, but largely speaking, he probably had him up against the fence for like 15 minutes of this fight. Maybe like one or two of those minutes was him fighting for takedowns. Like, it was largely just him trying to hold Masvidal up against the fence. As far as him going for heavy shots, occasionally when Masvidal would get close to separating, that's when Usman off of separation would find some shots. But again, for the most part, it was arm punches, it was stomps to the feet, it was a bunch of strikes that were not going to do anything to bring about a finish. And as a ref, when you see that, you have to be quicker to make warnings, especially if it's happening round over round, and you're going to have to be willing to separate these guys. And I know for a fact, for obvious reasons, that Mark Goddard was the ref in the last Kamaru Usman fight because Colby Covington made a big deal of it. I'm pretty sure Goddard was the ref in the Woodley fight as well. I think he's the one who made that comment about how this is a fight, not a wrestling match. So it seems as though, for whatever reason, Goddard keeps getting all the Kamaru Usman title fights, this one included. He definitely messed up in the Colby Covington one, whether it was calling fouls that weren't there, or not calling strikes to the back of the head. I mean, there were a few different mess ups that he had that seemed to benefit Kamaru Usman more so than it benefited Colby. And definitely in this fight, it seems as though his unwillingness to call stalling or to separate this fight up against the fence when Kamaru Usman was not making a great effort to go for takedowns, he was not making a great effort to create space and land heavy shots that could alter the fight. It seemed as though some of the biggest shots that he was landing in the clinch were just him like head fighting, trying to go head to head and accidentally, so to speak, headbutting Jorge Masvidal and causing cuts that way. So I would have liked to have seen Mark Goddard be a lot more aggressive here in terms of how he officiated this fight. Had he done that, either that means Kamaru Usman's going to have to be more aggressive up against the clinch, and maybe he lands some heavier shots, maybe even puts on a better performance as a result of being pushed by the referee. Maybe it goes the opposite way, where Kamaru Usman just doesn't feel safe fighting for some of those takedowns, or didn't want to expend the energy, and maybe by him being forced to go back to the middle, it creates an opening for Masvidal to land something big. You never know. But either way, I really feel as though Mark Goddard could have done a much better job here in terms of getting this fight to be a lot more action-packed. Again, you have to blame both fighters. You have to blame Masvidal for getting put in those positions in the first place. You have to blame Usman for being conservative from those positions and not trying to create the space to land a heavy shot, and not trying to force takedowns for most of the time that he was up against the fence and work his way towards the finish on the ground either. But it did feel like there was a lot more that could have been done here from the ref to make this fight a lot more exciting than it was. But ultimately, Kamaru Usman ends up getting the win. You look at the total strike versus significant strike count, it's kind of comical in that total strikes were 263 for Kamaru Usman, but significant were 94. I don't even know that I'd call 94 of his shots significant, but either way, that's how it was scored. And ultimately, Usman gets the win. There's some talk that Masvidal only had 6 days heading into this fight, and so if he gets a rematch, it should be a lot more competitive. I don't know that I see that as being the case. It definitely hurt that Masvidal seemed to be getting tired pretty quickly in this fight. I think if he had better preparation, he probably would have lasted a little bit longer before getting tired. But from a technical standpoint, do I see this fight being a whole lot different the second time around? I guess it could be if his coaches are a lot more aggressive about making sure that he keeps his back off the fence. There are some tactical changes that he could make, but those tactical changes probably should have been made in this first fight too. I don't really know what the reason why. I just don't understand the reasoning for him to have his back up against the fence as much as it was. I understand that he likes to fight that way sometimes, but for him it depends. It's not as though every time he fights someone he's always got his feet on the black lines, always circling around the fence. But for whatever reason in this fight, there were large portions of it where that's what was happening. And as Usman would start to walk him up against the fence, rather than like trying to stick and pivot his way back to the center, he would just kind of wait there and wait for Usman to throw first, and oftentimes that would lead to him getting caught up against the fence, and it just wasn't the right way to go about it. But either way, Masvidal, it seems like he is a pretty big star heading into this fight. It seems like a lot of people are really excited to see him fight. So with that being said, it's not going to take him nearly as long to get back to a title fight as it would other guys. Obviously, we've seen this with Conor McGregor, where he beats Cowboy Cerrone after losing to Khabib, and it seems as though people are trying to push him back into a fight with Khabib already. Masvidal is not as big of a star as Conor, but I think some of the things that we see Conor get in terms of preferential treatment and ability to only win like 1 or 2 fights and then be back in a title picture, I think Masvidal is going to be in a similar spot. So for him, he just needs to get a win in his next fight, and I think there will be enough excitement around him, especially if it's an exciting win, for him to get back in there. For Usman, it sounds like Gilbert Burns is going to be next for him. That's perfectly fine. As far as that being a tough matchup for him, again, I just don't know what to make of it because this fight's happened so many times in the gym. Both of them know where they're at with each other. There's this expectation I think a lot of people have that Usman's not going to try to take Gilbert Burns down a bunch because Gilbert Burns is a black belt world champion, and so Usman's going to be forced to stand, and Gilbert Burns has heavy hands, so that could be trouble for him. I could see Gilbert Burns being trouble for him on the feet with his heavy hands, although I also think that Gilbert Burns kind of relies on the same couple of combos every so often. If you train with him a lot and you get used to that, that could definitely give Usman a big advantage there in terms of being prepared for Gilbert's best shots. On the ground, Gilbert Burns is more of a top player than he's a bottom player. He is good off of his back, but it's not as though he's like a killer off of his back where the second you get on top of him, you better be watching out for like triangle chokes and arm bars. I don't know that it's the best idea for Usman to try to stay on top of Gilbert Burns for most of the fight, but I also don't think that Gilbert Burns is at a level off of his back, particularly in that particular position where Usman's going to be completely unwilling to take him down. And even with that being said, we saw how this last fight happened, where Usman was willing to just hold a guy up against the fence and just land a bunch of arm punches and insignificant strikes and kill time and win the fight that way. And that's a strategy that he could also use against Gilbert Burns, who I believe is much smaller than him as well. So it's not as though I see Gilbert Burns as being like this guy who's like a terrible matchup for Kamaru Usman and who's like the baking soda to his vinegar, so to speak. But if that's the fight that's next, it's still a fight I want to see. It's still an exciting matchup. I think there's a lot more that can come out from a storyline perspective because of these guys training together for a while. And if this fight has more of a build-up, maybe we'll get some more of that as well. But it does seem like there's a little bit of friction between the two. Over the course of the week, there were a lot of tweets that people were putting up talking about how they were supporting Masvidal and wanted to see Masvidal win, and Gilbert Burns was liking them. So I think there's an assumption that whenever you have people who train together a lot, that they're going to be pretty friendly. It doesn't seem as though Usman and Masvidal are the best of friends, even though they, or not Masvidal, Usman and Burns are the best of friends, even though they train together for a while. So from a storyline perspective, I think there's a lot more that could come out in that fight that'll make it a lot more interesting. But as far as Burns being like a terrible matchup for Usman, I don't know about that. It can still be a very difficult fight for Usman. It can be a fight that Burns wins. But I think some people just really want to see Kamaru Usman lose after this fight and after the way that he approached that fight, and thinking about back to some of his older fights that have been boring as well. But I don't know that Burns is going to be the guy who's just going to run right through him like some people expect. Fight before that was Alexander Volkanovski versus Max Holloway. First and foremost, I was a little skeptical on this idea, but really quick in the first round, it became clear that Max Holloway was full of shit. So heading into the fight week, Max Holloway was talking about how he hadn't really been able to train with much of his training partners or work with his coach as much, and most of what he was doing was on Zoom. I had taken some time off because of COVID because I was forced to. My timing was absolute shit. For Max Holloway, immediately after this fight starts, you could tell that his timing was there. He had fantastic timing, was doing a really good job, really good in managing space. There's zero chance that he was just training on Zoom for most of this camp. He was definitely working with people in person. So fun storyline for him to at least push that and at least create some doubt in terms of him training on Zoom and not actually having proper training heading in this camp. But it's pretty clear based off how this fight got out, or how this fight started, especially with how good his timing was at that point. That Max Holloway had good preparation for this fight. It wasn't like he was just doing Zoom workouts and then had to go in and fight the featherweight champion of the world. But either way, Max Holloway's strategy was a lot different in this fight than it was in the first fight. He was using a lot more kicks than he had both in that first fight and then also in prior fights to that as well, and he was finding a lot of success with that. A couple different times he had staggered and even dropped Volkanovski with kicks. The punches were there as well, but it just was much less of a boxing-centric strategy versus the first fight, and I think part of the reason why is because he was getting shoot up with the leg kicks in the first fight. So by him using the kicks more as well, he was able to fight at a range. So whereas in the first fight, it was kind of like Volkanovski was able to fight from a kickboxing range, which tends to be longer than just a regular boxing range, versus Holloway just fighting from a boxing range. Holloway decided to also fight from a kickboxing range in this fight, was finding a lot of early success that was putting Volkanovski behind. I would definitely say the first 2 rounds should have both gone to Max Holloway. So at that point, it's like, okay, well, Holloway's a guy who typically gets better over time. And fights better over time. So if he's already up in the first 2 rounds, he's probably going to just run away with this fight and take his belt back without much trouble. Ultimately, that's not exactly what happened. Volkanovski was able to make some adjustments, both on his own and with the help of his corner. And part of it was him having success with leg kicks over time. That was limiting the mobility of Holloway and sort of limiting when he felt comfortable throwing his kicks and when he didn't. But he was also finding a home for his punches as well. So as the fight went on, it was getting a lot more competitive. The third round was a very tight one. It was one of those ones where it's not like I was watching it as closely like a judge would. Once it was over, I was kind of like, I think Holloway edged that one out, but I'm not sure. Volkanovski was super close in that. I wouldn't be mad if Volkanovski gets it. And again, with MMA, you can talk about, over the course of the full fight, one guy did more damage than the other, therefore that guy should have won. Fights are scored round by round. I would not give Max Holloway a 10-8 round in either of the first 2 rounds. It'd be 10-9, 10-9. So from that point, for Max Holloway to win, he's got to get one more 10-9 round, whether it's 3, 4, or 5. Did he get a 10-9 round in 3? I was sort of leaning that way, but again, I wasn't watching it close enough to really be that sure of it. So it's definitely possible and reasonable to think, okay, well, after 3, it's 2-1 Holloway. 4th round comes around, and from there, Volkanovski was outlanding Holloway a little bit more even in that round than he had in the prior round. Holloway did land some pretty heavy shots in that round, but Volkanovski was steadily landing over the course of the whole round. I thought that Volkanovski had won that round when I watched it, so I figured at that point probably 3-1 Holloway, maybe 2-2. And then the 5th round, I thought Volkanovski had done enough to win that as well. So at that point, it's like probably 3-2 Holloway, maybe 3-2 Volkanovski. So it goes to the judges, and 2 of the judges went 3-2 Volkanovski. 1 of the judges went 3-2 Holloway, and so Holloway lost. I thought Holloway was going to get the decision when they pulled it up, but it's not as though this was a fight where it was like so clearly that Holloway had won at least 3 of the rounds to me. So a lot of people online were talking about how this was just an absolute robbery, that Max Holloway should have won that fight. He got completely screwed over. I thought he won when I watched the fight, but it wasn't one where I was like, oh yeah, Holloway's got this. I'm like, yeah, Holloway should have it, but it wasn't like, if they give it to the other guy, like, absolute robbery. I haven't had a chance to rewatch the fight. I'm probably not going to be able to rewatch it for a little bit anyway. But I don't think this was like a massive con job. I could see how Volkanovski would have won that fight, especially in that 3rd round, with it being as close as it was. I can also see the frustration of watching Holloway drop Volkanovski a couple times, him not get dropped over the course of the fight. It'd be a close fight and then have the fight go towards Volkanovski, but because it is round by round, it does seem like there is an argument that can be made that Volkanovski got 3, 4, and 5. Again, when I was watching live, I was leaning Holloway on 3, so I had Holloway 1, 2, 3. But there was definitely an argument that Volkanovski could have had it. So as far as everyone being completely outraged and thinking Holloway got screwed, I don't know that it was that outrageous. I thought he won, but I didn't think it was like that outrageous for it to go the other way. And as far as where they go from here, that's where it gets really tricky. Because for Max Holloway, this was his chance to get his belt back and sort of even up the score with Volkanovski. Some people think he did even up the score with how it went. These guys have fought 10 rounds together, and they've been very competitive in all 10 rounds. Or they've been competitive with each other over the course of the 10 rounds. You can't run this back for a 3rd fight at this point. Even if you think that Holloway won, it just doesn't make sense to have the featherweight title just contested between the 2 of them over the course of an entire year. Just Holloway, Volkanovski 1, Holloway, Volkanovski 2, and then make Holloway, Volkanovski 3 for later in the year. That's not going to make too much sense. But with that being said, featherweight's in a really weird spot right now where a lot of their top contenders aren't exactly taken. I know Zabit's number 2 in the division right now. I believe I know Ortega's got a fight with someone. I think it's Ortega versus Korean Zombie, but those guys are also in the top 5. But it seems like right now there isn't like a clear standout number 1 contender at featherweight. A fight that would be determining who is that clear standout number 1 contender at featherweight still is yet to happen. So at that point, if that fight happens, if we wait on that fight to happen before we book the next featherweight title fight, and the winner of that fight ends up getting injured, like what do we do from there? Do we just slide someone else in? Do you make the Max Holloway fight again? Like it's just sort of a weird spot right now with featherweight, just because the top contenders haven't been terribly active in 2020. But it does seem like you're going to give Volkanovski some time to recover here. You're going to have to give Holloway some time to recover as well. Hopefully, by the time that they're recovered and starting to look at the next fight, that we get that number 1 contender fight, and the winner of it is then booked for a title, or booked for a title fight. If Ortega wins it, I don't know that you want to book him immediately, because Ortega hasn't fought since he lost to Max Holloway. So if he loses to Holloway, gets 1 win, do you really want to put him right back in there for a title fight? I don't know about that. If Korean Zombie wins, then you probably put him in there. Maybe Yair Rodriguez gets a fight on relatively short notice, and he gets to get another win, and maybe at that point, because he has a win over Korean Zombie, even though it's a fight he was losing that he just stole in the last like 10 seconds, maybe somehow he gets pushed in towards a title fight. With Zabit, again, maybe something comes up where you want to give him a title fight. But right now it's just sort of a weird spot where there isn't really a clear number 1 contender that deserves the fight right now, that isn't already booked. So for featherweight, I don't think they're going to have solutions for this immediately. I would think that whoever the number 1 contender is, you have to give him to Volkanovski. And then for Max Holloway, either he fights someone who's waiting in the wings right now, or he fights the loser of that fight that's likely going to be a number 1 contender fight with Ortega. But either way, featherweight's kind of in a weird spot right now. They do have a lot of really good fighters, especially at the top of the division, but they just haven't been all that active. So hopefully the UFC is able to book some more fights at the top of that division, and really build up some contenders and build up a lot of interest in terms of who the top guys are and who's going to earn a shot next. Fight before that was Petr Yan versus Jose Aldo. Man, I feel like every time I talk about Aldo, I just keep bringing up how he just hasn't thrown a lot of leg kicks recently, and my assumption for why it is it's not that he doesn't know how to do it anymore, but you throw enough leg kicks, especially as hard as he throws his kicks over time, you hit enough knees, you hit enough shins, you hit enough elbows, that you just become unwilling to throw those kicks anymore, just because you've had your foot broken so many times, or you've had it bruised so many times and battered so many times. And he's had some major fights, including the 2 fights with Holloway, where he just wasn't throwing that many leg kicks. It sort of made sense sometimes with the Egger fights, because Egger was really good about catching those leg kicks and going for takedowns, but it's not like Holloway was ever trying to do that with him. There was talk that Petr Yan in this fight wasn't trying to do that either, so that's why he felt comfortable doing it, but I don't know if that's the real reason. So it was odd that over the course of the Holloway fights, the leg kicks really weren't there for Aldo that much, but in this fight they were. He was using them a lot in the first round, swept Yan off his feet early with them. I don't know if the idea here for Aldo is that he just remembered using them to great effect in training against Petr Yan 4 years ago, and so that's why he felt comfortable bringing him back right now. I don't know what the reasoning was, but we did get to see leg kicking Jose Aldo back, and it was really nice. It sort of like brought me back in time to back in the old WEC days, and remembering how big a fan I was of him back then, and just watching him chew people up with leg kicks. But early on in the fight, he was having some decent success. Unfortunately for him, though, at the end of the first round, shoots him for a takedown. Yan defends it perfectly and ends up on top. From there, lands a really nice punch to the body. There was some talk that possibly it was a broken rib. It was sort of hard to see where it landed, because it did look like it landed pretty low on the abdomen. I don't know if it would have hit a rib or not, but it definitely hurt Aldo. Again, that's sort of unclear. It looked like it could have been in one of those spots where sometimes if you're like in the middle of taking a breath, and your diaphragm isn't expanded, but it's kind of like contracted, and you're about to, or like you just breathe, like you inhale, your diaphragm gets larger, you exhale, and then it kind of gets smaller as the air goes out. Sometimes if you get punched in the stomach right as you're exhaling and right as the air has gone out, then it's tough to expand it back right away and bring more air in, so it just kind of like stuns you. It's sort of tough to tell whether or not that's what happened with that punch, where Aldo would just punch at the wrong time and he was having trouble like catching his breath, and that's why there was the grimace on his face, or whether, as the announcers had mentioned, that there was a possibility of a broken rib, because where the punch landed, it looked like it might have been more of one of those taking the breath away type of punches than it was like a broken rib type of punch, but it's not entirely clear from there. If it was a broken rib, then that you'd have to give Aldo a ton of respect for being able to fight through that broken rib for the next 3.5 rounds and do as well as he did for most of them, up until that 5th round at least. But either way, it seemed as though that was a moment that sort of turned the fight, and it definitely gave a round that looked like it could have been going to Aldo. It made sure that Petr Yan got that round. Second round comes around, and this was a really interesting change for Aldo. So Aldo came out in the first round in more of a boxing stance and was initially looking to throw punches, but was also adding in the leg kicks as well, to a pretty good effect. In the second round, he just came out like a Thai fighter, like was constantly like keeping that lead leg light, just sort of popping it up and down. Wasn't using a ton of footwork. Was just treating it like a Muay Thai fight, and it was kind of entertaining to watch that. But from that Muay Thai stance, he was landing a lot of really heavy leg kicks, a lot of heavy body kicks as well, and it seemed as though that sort of threw Petr Yan off. Now, granted, for Petr Yan, his main camp is Tiger Muay Thai in Thailand, so if there's ever a place you want to be prepared for someone who's going to come out in a traditional Muay Thai stance and try to fight you that way, training out with Tiger Muay Thai has got to be the spot. So for Petr Yan, it's probably weird to him to see Aldo come out in that stance and fight in that manner. But with that being said, he's very well prepared for that style. So although Aldo was having some success early in the round, just kind of catching him off guard with it, I think Yan was able to make some adjustments pretty quickly to that. And then over the course of the round, Aldo started to move away from that traditional Muay Thai stance and was back to fighting in a traditional boxing style a little bit more. But again, we're still landing some decent leg kicks. Second round was fairly close. Third round, again, another pretty competitive round. We were starting to see over time that Aldo was finding a home for that lead left hook that he likes to throw to the body. Yan was able to block a few of them. A few of them got through, but sort of got through on the side rather than like directly on the liver. But then over the course of the fight, Yan was starting to make some more reads for himself. You could see him early on that he was trying to land his cross. He's really good both from the orthodox stance and also the southpaw stance in terms of lunging forward with that cross and finding a home for it. He was going for it pretty early on, wasn't finding a home for it, but over time was starting to find it a little bit more. Fifth round comes around, he's able to drop him pretty early. I think he had him stumble and then eventually took him down. I don't remember if it was a drop or if it was a stumble and then eventually a takedown off of that, but either way he gets Aldo to the ground, ends up in the top of his half guard, landing really heavy shots from top, eventually forces Aldo to turtle, and then from the turtle position, lands a bunch of unanswered shots. There was some talk online that the ref let this go way too long. I think for one, whenever people talk about unanswered shots, what they're talking about is punches before Aldo throws a punch of his own. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every unanswered shot is a shot that landed clean or a shot that did damage. For the most part, a lot of these shots were being blocked by Aldo. And that's a big part of the reason why the ref let it go on as long as it did, is that even though Yan was throwing a lot of shots, all of those shots were being blocked by Aldo. Some of the ones that weren't being blocked were to the back of the head. And it's sort of tough as a ref where you see this fight that's about to be finished, you see a couple of illegal shots come in, and you have to make a decision. Do I stop this fight right now, let the guy on bottom recover, and then reset it in a position where he's not likely to be finished anymore? Or do I just give a couple verbal warnings and hope that the guy on top stops so I don't have to take this great position away from him? So he did give a warning to the back of the head, but he didn't really do much more than that. There were a few more shots that did land to the back of the head. But for the most part, Aldo was able to block most of the shots. Now, with that being said, blocking a shot is good in the short term, but in the long term, you have to be able to get out of that position and improve position. And that's really where Aldo was having trouble. He wasn't doing a very good job of improving position. Part of it was that he was tired. Part of it was that Yan was keeping really good pressure on top, and ultimately the ref had to step in, call a stop to the fight, and Petr Yan became the bantamweight champion of the world. As far as where each of these guys go from here, Yan versus Cejudo is a fight I wanted to see for a while. I don't think Cejudo is coming back for that fight, so unfortunately it's not a fight that we're going to get, or a fight that we're not likely to get at least. So from there, you're probably looking at either Cody Garbrandt or Aljamain Sterling as far as who's next for Petr Yan. It was kind of weird that when asked in the post-fight press conference, Dana White did not commit to Aljamain Sterling getting it, even though from a merit standpoint he's definitely done enough to get it. I can understand that the Garbrandt versus Yan fight is probably going to sell better. If that fight were to be tomorrow, I think it sells better, but over time, if they have time to actually promote that fight, I think that Cody Garbrandt and Petr Yan are going to do a better job of promoting a fight together than Aljamain Sterling and Petr Yan are. With that being said, though, Sterling has done more to deserve that title shot, and I think that's the fight that we really want to see right now, so hopefully that's the fight that they make. For Aldo, it's tough because, again, he was very competitive with the guy who's the champion here. So for him, he knows that he can hang with the best guy in the world at 135, or at least the guy who has the title at 135. So that has to be frustrating. With that being said, for Aldo, I don't like the lifestyle changes he's had to make 135. I don't think it's been best for his health. And for him, if he wants to keep fighting, I would like to see him move back to 145, because right now, what it's going to take for him to get back to a title shot at 135, it's going to take a long time in terms of him having to win a few more fights. That means he's going to have to live a lifestyle where he's within striking range of 135 over the course of that time. which is likely to be well over a year. Don't think that's a great idea for him. At featherweight, I mean, look, it's not like he's necessarily going to get a title shot there either. The champion has a win over him. The top challenger in Max Holloway has 2 wins over him that were pretty dominant. I don't think he's going to beat Holloway if they fight again. Now, granted, if he's throwing leg kicks again and he wants to get back to that, maybe a third fight with Holloway would be a lot more competitive than the first 2. But I don't see that fight being made, and I don't see a lot of people being excited to watch it based off of how the first 2 fights went anyway. So for him, it seems as though his days of being a champion are likely over right now, just because to be a champion you have to be better than everyone else, or at least you have to be better than the guy who holds the belt. He's not better than the guy who holds the belt at bantamweight right now. The 2 top guys at featherweight right now both have pretty clear wins over him as well, so it's not as though I see him winning the featherweight belt either. So for him, if he's going to keep fighting, he's probably going to be one of those guys who hangs around as a top contender, as a guy who you have to get through if you're going to earn your way to the title fight, and a guy who, if he's able to get a couple wins over those guys, might find himself in another title fight again, but I don't think anyone really expects him to win that. So given where he's at, you might as well be comfortable if that's going to be the role that you're going to fill. So for him, I'd like to see him move back up to 145, maybe even move up to 155 if he, depending on what he walks around at. I don't know, after the last year or so of him being at bantamweight, I think he probably took off enough weight where 155 doesn't make a whole lot of sense for him right now. But him going back to 145, having 10 less pounds to cut, if he wants to keep fighting, I think that's probably going to be the move for him right now. And there are enough new guys in the division that he hasn't fought before that he can fight, where you can still have exciting fights at 145, but he's just not going to have to basically kill himself to make that weight like he has been at 135. Next fight on the card was Rose Namajunas and Jessica Andrade. This ended up being fight of the night. I thought that the Aldo versus Yan fight should have been fight of the night, but this is still a very good fight either way. You can see some pretty big adjustments made by both of them from the first fight over to this one. For Andrade, rather than taking this fight the traditional way that she's taken most fights, where she just kind of storms forward, oftentimes keeps her head fairly static, but just kind of like runs forward and throws looping hooks left and right and just tries to take people's heads off. In this fight, she tried to be a little bit more tactical and use a lot more head movement. Now, granted, the head movement that she was using was kind of predictable in that it was just constantly left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. Like, there wasn't, like, splits in timing. Or it's not like she would go left and then kind of, like, hang at left a little bit and then maybe go back to center and then go over to the right, or maybe left, left, center, left. Like, it was just kind of left, right, left, right, left, right, really predictable. But either way, it made her less hittable than she was in the first fight, I guess. So in the first fight, Rose Namajunas was just lighting her up, particularly with her straight punches. In this fight, Namajunas was having to make some more adjustments before she could find a home for her shots. And wasn't able to pick sort of like a brawler, so to speak. Wasn't able to pick the brawler apart like she was in the first round of their first fight. But with that being said, she was definitely outlanding Andrade and was able to win the first round for sure. Second round, pretty similar story. Was able to win that round as well. In the third round, Andrade came out a little bit more aggressive, was actually able to land some pretty heavy shots. One of the downsides that Namajunas has is that she likes to keep her lead hand low and relies on her reaction time in terms of bringing that lead hand up to block if a punch gets through and she's not able to move her head out of the way. But unfortunately for her, ends up getting clipped here. It clipped especially bad on the left side of her face, which again is the side that would be covered by that lead hand. Got hurt, was on her back after getting tossed, after getting rocked. But was able to survive from there, gets back to her feet, and then from there was able to just do enough to survive the round and win by a score of 2-1. So for Namajunas, wasn't as impressive a performance as what we saw in the first fight prior to her getting knocked out. So the first round of the Andrade fight, number 1, was definitely more impressive than any round that she had in this fight. But with that being said, still gets the win over a top contender, is now the number 1 contender at the division, and it sounds like she's going to be the next one in line for Zhang Weili. So seems like that's going to be the next fight for them to make. I don't know what the timeline is going to be. Rose, sometimes it seems like she likes to take a long time between fights. For Zhang Weili, she's fighting out of China. I don't know what sort of restrictions she's going to have to deal with in terms of her taking another fight right now, whether Fight Island would work for her. And she just has to get clearance. I guess same thing goes for Rose Namajunas. We know Fight Island works for her because she just fought on Fight Island. But it's going to take her a little while to get back. Obviously, her face needs to heal up, and she's going to need to get a camp ready before she fights Zhang Weili. So I'm not sure when that fight will be, but it does seem like that's going to be the next fight to make. And then the first fight on the card, we had Amanda Ribas versus Paige Van Zandt. Last fight on Paige Van Zandt's contract. I think the assumption here was that Paige Van Zandt was going to leave the UFC after it. So interesting choice by the UFC to put her on the main card of a really big pay-per-view, and that it draws a lot of eyes to her. And in theory, if she had a good performance, then you'd want to have her around for the next fight as well and build off of that. But ultimately, there was not a very good performance from Paige Van Zandt. For the brief moments that this fight was within striking range. I guess it was kind of competitive. Paige landed a couple shots, Ribas landed a couple shots, but ultimately Ribas was able to get her clinched up against the fence, landed a nice hip toss, and then from top had like a scarfold Kesakatami type of position. Was sort of like a tough spot for Ribas to hold, in that it's not as though it was secure enough where she could kind of like take a hand away and then start throwing some punches. She was just kind of trying to control from there. Took her a little bit of time. Paige Van Zandt at one point like threw a hook around and was like trying to sneak her way to the back if she could get her head free. Ribas made an adjustment so she couldn't, but eventually that position sort of turned into a little bit of a scramble, and then within that scramble, Ribas was able to snag her arm, went for an armbar from there. Had to make a few more adjustments from there. She was in her guard. Typically in the guard, you rather than like finishing under the armpit, you'll try to just try to like get it up against your chest and then extend out. But at that point, Van Zandt was doing a decent job of stacking and keeping her from doing that. So at that point, she kept it under the armpit and then bellied out, and then turned into a belly down armbar. And based off of the angle that they showed, it was hard to tell how bad that armbar was, but just because you couldn't really see the elbow, but you could see at the end there where Paige Van Zandt's shoulder was and then where her wrist was pointing, and it definitely did not look natural at all. So Van Zandt definitely hung in there as tough as she possibly could, but it looks like her arm was being bent pretty badly, and she had to tap. She did tap, and ultimately there, Ribas gets the win. So for Ribas, it's a big card for her. She gets some good exposure, gets a win over someone that a lot of people know of, so that'll help her out a lot. She's talking about fighting the winner, Marina Rodriguez versus Carlos Esparza next. So that could be a fun fight for her, and if she gets the win, then obviously that pushes her up pretty high in the division. Marina Rodriguez would be a pretty tough matchup for her. I don't know if I like that matchup for her, but Carlos Esparza would be a lot more interesting as well. But either way, that's fun for her, and it definitely, even if she doesn't move up in the strawweight division for this win at flyweight against an unranked fighter, it does seem like she's going to get a pretty good opportunity next at strawweight. And if she's able to get a good performance there, she's going to be able to work her way up that division. Has a pretty fun personality as well, so that's going to work in her favor as well. So really good performance for Ribas. I can definitely see her getting some really good opportunities in the top 10 at strawweight after this. As for Paige Van Zandt, I think the plan for her regardless was to go on to Bellator. Kind of sucks that her last high-profile fight is her just getting run over by Amanda Ribas, but ultimately that's a risky take when you have to fight someone like Ribas. That's the result that she had, and for her, she still has the marketability based on her looks. It's not as though she was someone who people really want to see because they thought she was going to be a future champion anyway. So I guess to that extent, a lot of what makes her valuable is still there. So if Bellator wants to bring her in and pay her for that, I don't know that she's going to lose a ton of money based on that performance, but either way, it's not as though this performance is going to help her a ton either. And then as far as Bellator goes, it's unclear if she does sign in Bellator, what sort of opportunities are going to be there. It's still pretty odd to me that Bellator hasn't had a fight since COVID hit back in March. You've seen some smaller promotions than them. I mean, KSW overseas is doing it. LFA has fights going on right now. Bellator, you would figure, with them having that deal that they had with DAZN, with them having the ownership stake from Viacom, and Viacom having a platform to put them on as well, you'd figure that for them, they could have had some events, even if they aren't putting their top guys out there right now, they could have had some events, and they really haven't. So for them, it's not entirely clear what the reasoning for that has been, where they're at in terms of financials. Can they afford to bring Paige Van Zandt on for the money that Paige Van Zandt thinks she's worth? I don't know. But there have been some rumbles that Bellator is going to be coming back for a show on July 25th, and that's going to be announced pretty soon. So we could potentially learn a lot more about what Bellator is planning to do next and where they're planning to move on from here. But it does seem kind of odd that we've had so much silence out of them over the last 4 months. I'm hoping that they're in decent financial position. They're going to be able to hang around for a while, because having them around is good for MMA. They put on good fights themselves, and it's just another option for fighters to get paid. So if they feel like the UFC isn't paying them what they're worth and they actually are worth more, then Bellator can pay them that and still be profitable, because ultimately if you're worth a lot as a fighter, that means that you're bringing in money for your promoter. So if fighters think that they're bringing in a lot more than what the UFC is paying them, they go to Bellator and they can prove that, then good for them, and good for Bellator if they're able to take advantage of that. So I don't want to see Bellator out of the picture, but it does seem odd that they've been quiet for so long, and you would hope that they're looking to come back into a pretty normal schedule, and at that point it would make sense for them to bring in Paige Van Zandt, and that she'd be happy with the deal they offer them. Because if not, then, I mean, for Paige, maybe she does. If Bellator's off the table, I just don't know where she'd go. I guess if Bellator is off the table and they can't bring her in, that can mean bigger problems for Bellator. Maybe that means that Austin Vanderford leaves Bellator as well, and then she can go wherever he goes, whether he goes back to the UFC and then she goes to the UFC again, or they go somewhere else. But it does seem like right now odds are that Paige VanZant will not be back in the UFC, at least not for the foreseeable future, and she'll probably have a full contract with another promotion before she comes back, if she does come back. Okay, on the prelims, really good fight at light heavyweight between Volkanovski and Yuri Prochazka. I talked about this beforehand, where I was saying for Prochazka, if he gets a dominant win here, they can work his way up into the light heavyweight title picture pretty quickly. Especially given the fact that Ozdemir had a fight that most people thought he won over Dominic Reyes, and Reyes is a guy who a lot of people want to see in a title fight right now. For Ozdemir, if he got a win here, then you could have figured that with John Jones fighting over money as much as he has, that maybe it creates an opening in the meantime for a rematch with Dominic Reyes, and if he gets that win, then maybe he finds himself in the title picture. After the first round, it looked like Ozdemir was doing pretty well, and that was a possibility for him after this fight. Prochazka was fighting in a sort of bizarre way, trying to taunt him a lot, wasn't really all that successful doing that in the first round. Got clipped a couple times, got hurt up against the fence at one moment in the first round as well. But second round comes around, and Prochazka made a couple adjustments, was able to make an adjustment with his kicks as well. Ozdemir was expecting a low kick, was hit with a high kick, got stunned off of that, and then from there, Prochazka just kind of ran him up against the fence, landed a nice jab cross, and on the cross, he was able to knock him out, and knock him out badly up against the fence. So for him, even though it wasn't a great performance over the course of the full fight, the finish was fantastic. The finish was highlight reel stuff, and for that, Prochazka is likely going to get another fight against a top-ranked light heavyweight. So for him, though it doesn't necessarily put him in a position where a lot of fans are like, oh my god, this is going to be the guy to beat John Jones, it's going to put him in a position where he can fight against some other guys who are at the top of the division, and if he gets a knockout win against some of those guys, whether it's Thiago Santos, Dominic Reyes, even like a Corey Anderson or someone else like that, people tend to forget pretty quickly fight to fight. So if people just remember this finish that he had against Ozdemir, and then he has a really good fight in his next fight, I don't think people are going to be thinking too much about the first round that he had with Ozdemir. And so it might not take much for him to find his way in the light heavyweight title picture after this win. Fight before that was a decent striking match between Muslim Salikov and Eliseo Zaleski dos Santos. I thought Eliseo Zaleski dos Santos should have won this fight 2-1, but still a pretty close fight, and ultimately the judges split this one, so it was a split decision. Two of the judges were 29-28, one to dos Santos, one to Salikov. Another judge, who is an absolute idiot, went 30-27 Salikov. But I guess if he would have gone 29-28 rather than 30-27, I don't think people would be that crazy about it. The fact that he went 30-27 is kind of ridiculous, but this was a close fight. Salikov ended up getting the win. I don't think he should have, but when a fight's that close, it's sort of hard to be too mad. The fight before that was Danny Henry versus Makwan Amirkhani. Makwan, it's sort of weird how he seems to get tired really quickly in these fights. Like, had that fight against Burgos where he was exhausted and could barely hang on, and Burgos eventually finished him. In this fight, he gets a win in the first round, a little over 3-minute fight, and then has some time after the fight, gets his hand raised, walks out, goes over to get interviewed, and is still exhausted, and is like, hey guys, give me some time here, like I just need to catch my breath and get something to drink. But either way, luckily for him, this was a quick fight, so even though it seems as though his gas tank was kind of limited, it was enough to make it through the whole 3 minutes and 15 seconds. But gets a takedown on Danny Henry. Sort of has in a referee's position from a wrestling standpoint, but kind of like back turtle position. Really aggressive move by him, rather than trying to keep the back turtle position or try to go from back turtle to full back control with hooks. That he just kind of like went back towards the head, but fed in an anaconda choke when he did it. That's a move where it's one of those moves, and there are a lot of moves like this in jiu-jitsu where they kind of look good on Instagram because it's like really cool how you can go from one position into a submission really quick, but a lot of people don't do them because of the risk of position, where it's like you're in a really good position, you're risking the position that you have to go for it, and if you don't get it, then oftentimes you're going to end up in a really bad position. Like a lot of times there are submissions like that people can have from the mount that look really cool, but again, people don't want to risk it because if you're already in the mount, you don't want to risk giving up your mount. It's one of the reasons why you don't see a ton of arm bars from mount in MMA. Armbar from mount is a pretty common move, but if you miss it from mount, then you're giving up mount and you end up on your back. This was one of those moves where it's like, it's a cool move. It's a move a lot of people know, but a lot of people don't necessarily go for it because of the risk of position. But for Amirkhani, I guess for him, he's really comfortable with that choke, and I guess with the wrestling that he has, he figures, hey, if I miss it and I end up on bottom, I can work my way back up into a neutral position pretty easily. So he takes the risk, goes for it, feeds through the anaconda choke. Looks like he had it pretty tight initially, but Danny Henry was able to survive it. Amirkhani makes a couple of little adjustments, and then from there he's able to choke him out. Notices that he's out, lets go, and then lifts up his legs at the end there to try to like help bring him back too. But really good performance from Amirkhani.
briefly had him on the ground, but was able to do a lot over the course of that brief period of time there. Fight before that was a really bad fight between Leonardo Santos and Roman Bogotov. Just a bizarre fight out of both of them. From what the announcers were saying, Bogotov likes to wrestle most of the guys he fights, and putting him up against a fantastic jiu-jitsu champion definitely made it tough for him to do that, and I guess it made him unwilling to do that. So you have a guy who's a wrestler who's having to strike with Santos. He's fighting a wrestler that he figures he's probably not going to be able to take down and control on the ground too easily, so he's turning into a striking match. So you kind of have like this really bad striking match that came out of it. Santos seemed to gas pretty early, and it seemed like every time he got clipped in the nuts, or even sometimes hit relatively hard there, that he took all the time he possibly could to recover there. So there was a lot of downtime in this fight. But with that being said, even from a technical standpoint, Leonardo Santos is so good in his jiu-jitsu. Like he's accomplished so much that it's tough for me to ever like say that like he's making major mistakes out there. I think for him it was more just like a tactical decisions than it was like him not knowing how to do better from certain positions. But it was surprising that every time he would get sort of to a similar back control position that I was talking about with Amir Khani and Danny Henry, that for Santos, rather than like trying to work for submissions or trying to work for back control, he would just kind of like hang there and just hold on to the position. Which is really unusual for a black belt world champion. Usually with them, if they get you in back turtle, they're trying to get hooks in and take your back and choke you out. Whereas with Santos, it seems like he had no interest in doing that with Bogotov, which I thought was pretty odd. When he was on his back, he really wasn't terribly aggressive from there either. It just wasn't very aggressive at all on the ground, which is surprising for someone with the jiu-jitsu accolades that he has and the jiu-jitsu skill that he has. And then for Bogotov, it was just wild punches here and there. It seemed as though later in the fight he was doing pretty well. Just because he was in better shape than Santos. But again, he was making some weird decisions, especially after the 2 points were taken away. You figured that over the course of that last minute, he'd just be swinging wildly and trying to get a finish. Rather than that, he was clinching up with Santos. It just wasn't a great tactical fight from either of them. Wasn't a really good performance from either of them because they were being forced out of their A game into like their C and D game. So it just ultimately wasn't a very good fight for Santos. He's 40 years old. I believe he's like 7-0-1 in the UFC right now, which is a great record on paper. But after watching that fight, I don't think there's anyone expecting him to ever make a decent run at lightweight, and obviously with his age, he'd have to make that run right now, and after watching that fight with Bogotov, I don't think anyone really sees him doing that, so he's probably in one of those positions where, since he's been winning, he'll probably get another fight, assuming he wants it, but I think the first time that he loses, the UFC is going to be quick to let him go. Fight before that was Marcin Tybura versus Max Grishin. This fight literally put me to sleep. From what I was awake and able to watch, it looked like Tybura was just holding Grishin up against the fence and taking him down and just controlling him over time. Not sure what was going on in the striking, but for whatever the case may be, Tybura did get the win there. Fight before that, we had Rolion Paiva versus Zhalgas Zhumagulov. Pretty tough fight. I thought that there was a chance that Zhalgas might have had this one at the end there. I wasn't watching this one super closely, especially not like in a judging standpoint. The fight before that sort of had me dozing off a little bit, and this fight didn't totally put me to sleep. Obviously, the Tybura versus the Grishin one actually did, and I ended up like waking up in the third round, like, oh crap, I just missed the last couple rounds. But either way, from what I saw of this fight, Zhalgas was doing a pretty good job early on. Paiva was doing a decent job of using his length. Pretty competitive fight, but in the end, Paiva ends up getting the win. Fight before that was Carl Rosa versus Vanessa Melo. This fight sucked. Rosa moves to 13-3. Melo's at 10-8. There just wasn't much in this fight that was like worth remembering. Like there wasn't like any really great striking exchanges in it. The wrestling, I mean, Rosa was able to get the fight to the ground at times, but it's not as though her wrestling looked fantastic at doing it. When she was on top, wasn't terribly aggressive about improving position or really like getting into positions where she could land heavy ground and pound. It was just a pretty stale fight overall. And the first fight on the card was not stale at all. Actually, a really fun fight between Martin Day and Davey Grant. Day likely did enough to win the first round. Had Grant hurt in the first round as well. Grant came back in the second round, had a much better performance. In the third round, was able to knock Day out. Throw in, I believe it was a rear hook, and then hit him, and then knocked him out the lead hook. So I think it was a rear right hook. And then it looked like Day's eyes were closed after that shot. Not as in like physically closed, not as in they like forced closed, but just as in like he had shut his eyes after that fight and didn't see the next punch coming, or not after that fight, after that punch, after the rear right hook, and then did not see the lead left hook coming, and ultimately that's what knocked him out. So for Davey Grant, really big win. Sounds as though he had his jaw broken in the first round, was able to fight through that and get to knockout, and also gets a $50,000 bonus on top of that for that knockout on the first fight on the card, which is pretty good for him, because usually when you see someone get a really nice knockout on the first fight of the card, especially on a card like this with as many high-profile fights as there were, you figured the odds of him getting a post-fight bonus, though it was a great knockout, are pretty low. But ultimately for him, he was able to get that bonus, and that extra $50,000 is definitely going to help him out a lot. So that covers it for UFC 251. From here, I guess I got to preview the upcoming fights. So right now, the plan is going to be for me to do just a post-fight podcast on UFC Fight Night, Fight Island 2, whatever they want to call it, the Qatar versus Ige fight. As far as I'm planning right now, I think I know I'm not going to be able to watch all the fights because I'm going to be at the gym for part of it, but I think I'll be able to get back in time where I can still see most of the main card and then do a recap on that right after. So I think that'll be the plan. But I'll still do the preview for this card right now. I'll do the preview for the July 18th card for next Saturday right now. And then if I do that podcast, it'll just be a recap right then. If not, then next Sunday's podcast will recap this fight, and then we'll recap the July 18th card as well. But either way, main event for July 15th, or for Wednesday, is going to be Calvin Kattar and Dan Ige. Really good fight at featherweight. Two guys who are really heavy-handed. Ige is a little less technical than Calvin Kattar is, but still likes to throw heavy looping punches. For Kattar, much better boxer. Very technical, really good at fighting off of his jab and working off of his jab, and then finding crosses, good head movement. Just really solid all around. Tough to take down and control over long periods of time as well. So for Ige, I don't really see him taking Kattar down and controlling him for much of this fight, especially with it being 5 rounds. It's likely going to be spent on the feet for the most part, and I think Kattar is, being the crisper boxer, having better technique, being a lot quicker with his straight punches than Ige is likely to be with his looping punches. I think that Calvin Kattar is going to be able to win this fight and probably get a finish as well. In the co-main event, and it's kind of surprising this is the co-main event given the fight that's going to happen right before it, but Tim Elliott will be fighting Ryan Benoit. Elliott's always in exciting fights, very unusual grappler, so for him, I guess that probably is part of the reason why they made this the co-main event. So it should be a fun fight. I was surprised that Elliott lost his last fight the way that he did. I'm trying to remember what the guy's name that he lost to was. He was making his UFC debut. I remember Elliott was gassed out. Brandon Royval, that's who it was. Brandon Royval. Yeah, that fight with Royval, Elliott was looking fantastic in the first round, and then the second round it seemed like he gassed out and tapped out to an arm triangle choke. They probably could have fought out a little bit better than he did. But either way, we're probably gonna at least get 1 minute or 1 round of hell here with Benoit if Elliott's not able to get the finish in that round. But even still, Elliott's got a really fun fighting style. There's a lot of unorthodox punches, very unorthodox on the ground, really good takedowns. Really good chokes as well, so it'll be fun to watch this fight. Fight before that, and this fight I think probably should have been the co-main event, just based off of where these guys have been within the division at bantamweight. But Jimmy Rivera and Cody Stamann. Rivera at one point was pretty close to a title fight, especially after he had that win over Uriah Faber that put Faber into retirement. Cody Stamann has been in there with some of the better guys in the division, hasn't had the results he's wanted. Obviously, he had the fight with Aljamain Sterling, where he lost by a Suluev stretch, but got a pretty good win recently. Was able to get that win in some pretty tough timing for him as well. Beat Brian Kelleher after his brother had passed away. So he's getting right back at it against Jimmy Rivera, who's always tough. Rivera had some opportunities against some of the top guys in the division. Had a fight against Petr Yan, for example. That fight with Yan didn't go very well for him. So he sort of moved back towards the bottom of the top 10. Stamann's sort of been a guy floating around like low top 10, high top 15 type of range. So these guys will be going at it. Should be a fun fight. I'd imagine he'll be on the feet for the most part. Stamann's got good wrestling. I don't know that he's going to try to take Rivera down or be terribly successful with that strategy. With that being said, I don't see Rivera taking him down or being successful with that either. So it's likely going to be a fight between two pretty heavy-handed guys at bantamweight that's going to stay on the feet for all 15 minutes. Fight before that, we have Talia Santos, who we don't know very much about, but apparently she's got 15-1 record, going up against Molly McCann, who seems to be in some pretty fun brawls for the couple fights I've seen of hers. So that should be a fun one. And then we got the return of Abdul Razak Al Hassan versus Munir Lazez, who I'm completely unfamiliar with. On the prelims, it's going to be John Phillips versus Khamzat Chimaev. Phillips, I'm surprised, is still in the UFC. I guess he had a pretty good performance in his last fight. But guy out of SBG, heavy hands, but not terribly technical. Not a fantastic striker, although striking is his best area. Not a great grappler either, but when you're as heavy-handed as him, sometimes you're able to get some big wins and keep yourself afloat. That's probably what brought him to the UFC in the first place, is that his wins are pretty exciting, and has been able to get a couple wins in the UFC that are keeping him around right now. But if he doesn't get a win here, this might be his last fight in the UFC, and his opponent is a 6-0 Swede, who I'd imagine is probably a pretty good prospect if they're bringing him in at 6-0. Fight before that is going to be Ricardo Ramos versus Lerone Murphy. Murphy's, I think he's had one more fight since that fight against Zubar Tukagov that happened last September. But that should be a pretty fun fight. Ramos is always a fun guy to watch. We got Modestas Bukauskas versus Andreas Michailidis. Don't know anything about either of these guys. Jared Gordon versus Chris Fishgold. This should be pretty fun. Fishgold had a great career in Cage Warriors. Pretty solid Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. Was a former champion in Cage Warriors. Has had mixed results in the UFC. Gordon's a guy who hasn't quite gotten in the top 15 of his division yet, but has always been a tough guy. Has had some good wins against some good guys. Has had some tough losses against other good guys. Obviously, he had that fight with Charles Oliveira that didn't go his way. But for him, if he gets a win over Fishgold, it sort of like keeps him where he's at, where he's like one of those guys who's probably like in that top 25 range, top 25, top 30 type of range. Not quite there where he's ready to get ranked yet, but still able to beat some of the lower ranked guys in the division for Chris Fishgold. If he loses here, it's going to be tough for him to sort of make a run at the top of the division. I think a lot of people had high expectations for him after his career in Cage Wars. Hasn't looked great to start in the UFC, but if he can get a win here over Jared Gordon, that would do a lot for him. Right before that, we have Diana Belbita versus Liana Joua. Don't know anything about these guys. Jack Shore versus Aaron Phillips. Phillips has a record of 5-3. Kind of surprised he's in the UFC. I'm not sure what the circumstances are with him getting here, but either way, he'll be fighting against Jack Shore, who's a 12-0 Welshman. And then the first fight on the card is going to be Jorge Gonzalez versus Kenneth Berg. I don't know a whole lot about either of these two as well. And then the fight card that'll be happening on Saturday, or next Saturday, is going to be headlined by Deiveson Figueiredo versus Joseph Benavidez. And I say that right now because that is what is planned right now. There is a ridiculous thing going on right now, and it affected the card yesterday. I believe I'm trying to remember what the guy's name was, but there was a guy who was supposed to be fighting on UFC 251 who tested positive for COVID 10 days before the card happened. I think 2 days later he had a negative test, but either way, because of that initial test that he had, they took him off the card. The thing is that right now, for how long COVID lasts in the system, I think from what I'm hearing, 6 days is a pretty normal number for that. At least with the gym that I'm at right now, my coach is saying, look, if you test positive, like at least take 6 days off. They prefer that you get a negative test, but if not, at least get the 6 days, at least 6 days without symptoms. There's talk of it lasting 2 weeks. I think 2 weeks is like the full duration, but it's not as though like once you test positive, that's day one. Oftentimes when people are testing positive for COVID, they're already well into the whole process. So it's kind of crazy that he was taken off of this card, and it sounds as though Deiveson Figueiredo had a positive COVID test that was at least long enough out where like, hey, we're not taking you off the card just yet, but you're going to have to test negative very soon. I'm not sure if he's had another test since then. He seems to think that the first test was a false positive, but either way, it does seem like there's a chance that Figueiredo will be taken out of a fight that still is a week away right now. If that happens, it seems like there's a decent chance that Benavidez will probably fight another guy who's on the card, and Alexander Pantoja. But with that being said, it just doesn't seem right that Figueiredo will be taken off the card, especially as early as it is. It also seems as though Gilbert Burns was fine yesterday. I don't know if he was negative for COVID yesterday or when he got... I don't even know if he's negative for COVID right now, but I think there's a decent chance that Gilbert Burns might be negative for COVID right now. There's a decent chance that he might have been negative for COVID yesterday and was taken off of a fight card because he was sick before the actual fight and actually would have been healthy on fight night. So I mentioned this last week, and it's still something that's annoying me. It seems like there's a chance that it could ruin Saturday's card as well. But it does seem pretty annoying how aggressive the UFC is about taking guys off of cards for positive COVID tests that are well in advance of their actual fight. I understand that when COVID first came out, we didn't know a whole lot about it, and so an overabundance of caution made sense. But at this point, we have a lot more data on COVID than we did before, especially on how dangerous it is for people the age of these fighters and in the health that the fighters are in. That 25 to 34 range, we're looking at like a 0.05% fatality rate. And again, that fatality rate is determined by taking deaths divided by positive tests. So for deaths, obviously if you have fewer deaths divided by the same amount of positive tests, that death rate goes down. If you have the same amount of deaths divided by more positive tests, the death rate goes down. And when you look at how the math is done here, the deaths, oftentimes it seems as though they're counting deaths with COVID as deaths of COVID, when in a lot of these cases there are other things that are at play here that are more consequential in someone passing away than just COVID itself, and the death probably should be attributed to that rather than COVID. So in many cases, the death number is higher than it actually should be. On the other end of the spectrum, a positive test rather than a case, there are plenty of people who have it who don't get tested for it and then never find out. Obviously, we've seen a lot of these fighters where they had no idea they had COVID. They get tested because they're forced to be tested, and all of a sudden it turns out that there was actually an actual case there. So the case numbers that we have are lower than what the actual case is. And obviously, if you look at the death rate versus the case number in the U.S. right now, the death rate has just gone down over and over and over, week after week after week, but the cases are going up right now. And it's not as though there are more cases of COVID right now than there were back when 1,000 people a day were dying. It's just that there are more positive tests now because there's more tests. So given that there's a 0.05% death rate for people in the 25 to 34 age group, that number is likely a lot higher than it actually is in reality, because there's probably a lot more cases than that are being calculated in there, and a lot of the deaths that are being included in there are deaths that probably should be attributed to something else. So even at 0.05%, that's a minuscule death rate, and at that rate, you probably shouldn't be cutting guys out of their fights a week ahead of a fight just because they had what's effectively a bad flu a week before their fight. But given what we know now about the death rates, it just doesn't make any sense to me at all that these guys are being taken out of these fights and having these opportunities taken away from them. And I really hope that Deiveson Figueiredo doesn't have his opportunity taken away from him. Now, granted, it's a little less hard to feel bad for him given that he had that opportunity before Joseph Benavidez and he missed weight, which was his own fault and had nothing to do with COVID. So if he loses an opportunity here, though he should not lose this specific opportunity, it's a little easier to stomach it just because of what happened the first time around. But with that being said, if he tested positive for COVID a week and a half ago, or a week and a half before his fight, and he's fine now, I don't want to see him taken off of this card. So for now, he's going to be in the main event against Joseph Benavidez. It'll be a rematch of their first fight. Benavidez was doing pretty well in the first round of that one. Then they had a clash of heads, and then right off of that clash of heads, Figueiredo was able to knock him out. Would have been the flyweight champion, but missed weight, so obviously you can't be a champion of a weight class you didn't make. And so they decided to run this fight back, given the fact that Figueiredo won and that Benavidez was doing well before the headbutt. So good opportunity for both of these guys to earn the title. Hopefully they both make weight. I think Benavidez should be able to make weight without a problem. But for Figueiredo, he missed weight the last time, so you can't necessarily count on him making weight this time, but hopefully he does. If they have to pull him off of the card, then hopefully Pantoja is going to be the guy they bring up and put him in the title fight. And then hopefully he makes weight. I don't think Pantoja's had too much trouble making weight in the past. So that'd be a fun fight as well. Co-main event's a great one. We've got a fight between Jack Hermansson and Kelvin Gastelum. Gastelum, a lot of people expected him to run through Darren Till. Till just fought really conservative, was able to fight from the outside and outpoint him in that fight. But Gastelum's had a really good career up to this point. Looked really good in that fight against Israel Adesanya as well. So for him, he's kind of in need of a win, though, because the other loss against Adesanya, he had the loss against Till. Hermansson was a guy who a lot of people thought was within striking distance of a title shot prior to his fight with Jared Cannonier. Cannonier was a little too much for him, especially as the fight wore on. He was able to get the win in that fight. So for Hermansson, a win over Gastelum puts him right back to where he was before that loss to Jared Cannonier, where he's pretty close to a title fight. So either way, winner of this fight's going to be in a pretty good spot. Loser of this fight, if it's Gastelum, then he's on a 3-fight losing streak. It's not entirely clear where he goes from there. Probably just continues to fight some of the top guys in the division. Hopefully gets a win. And then if Hermansson loses, sort of finds himself in a similar position to where Gastelum is right now, where he's coming off of 2 straight losses. Now, granted, Gastelum's a little bit in a different position because one of those losses was a barn burner with the champion that a lot of people thought was 2-2 heading into that last round. So it proved that he can hang with the best guy in the world, whereas Hermansson probably needs this win a little bit more, but even still, a must-win for both guys. Both guys are top middleweights that are coming off of losses. Fight before that, we're going to have Mark Chikasi versus Rafael Fiziev. Then we've got Ariane Lipsky versus Luana Carolina. And the first fight on the card, at least for now, is going to be Alexander Pantoja versus Askar Askarov, which should be a great flyweight fight, assuming that the main event doesn't get broken apart, and then they have to take one of these guys and put them in the title fight. But Askarov looked really good against Tim Elliott. Had some tough moments there, but Elliott's a tough guy to deal with. But was able to win the later rounds against Tim Elliott. Pantoja has had some great performances. I believe that him and Figueiredo fought, and I think Pantoja won that fight. I could be wrong about who won that fight, but either way, that was one of those fight of the night type of fights either way. So if for whatever reason Benavidez gets taken off and Figueiredo hangs around and we get a rematch between Pantoja and Figueiredo, that'd be awesome. If Pantoja ends up fighting against Benavidez, that'd be an awesome fight as well. But if he ends up fighting against Askarov, also a great fight. Pantoja's got fantastic jiu-jitsu. Askarov is known primarily for his wrestling, so if he decides to actually wrestle him, then we're going to have some really good exchanges on the ground. If he decides to keep it on the feet, Pantoja's striking has really improved a lot over time, and we can get some fireworks there as well. And the prelims, we got Roman Dolidze versus Kadis Abragamov, Grant Dawson versus Nadir Rahmani, Joe Duffy, who it feels like it's been forever since he's last fought in the UFC. He's making his return here against Joel Alvarez. We've got Brett Johns versus Montel Jackson, which is a really exciting fight at bantamweight. There was a time when Brett Johns appeared to be a real threat. I think he might have even broken in the top 15 at one point. He's 16-2 now, though. He'll be fighting Montel Jackson, who a lot of people have really high expectations for. Really long frame for the division. Really big hands, really good wrist control as a result of having those big hands. It's given a lot of problems to the guys he's fought so far. So if Jackson gets the win here, he might find himself fighting some ranked fighters pretty soon. If Brett Johns gets the win here, again, he might find himself in a similar position. I think this is kind of one of those fights where the winner, if they don't get a ranked opponent next, they're probably going to be fighting someone who's just outside the top 15 next. So a really good opportunity for both of them. We got Malcolm Gordon versus Amir Albazi. The return of Davi Ramos against Arman Saryukin. Really excited for this. Ramos is always an exciting fighter to watch. 2015 ADCC champion. Great jiu-jitsu. Really aggressive on the feet as well. Not necessarily the best striking from a technique standpoint, but very heavy hands and very aggressive. And the first fight on the card is going to be Carlos Felipe Aidno. I believe he's making his UFC debut against Sergey Spivak. So Spivak's got very good wrestling. I think the idea here is Felipe, who I know nothing about other than he's Brazilian, which sometimes that tells you all you need to know. I think the idea here is that Spivak likes to wrestle a lot of his opponents, and Felipe probably has a jiu-jitsu background, so it's probably going to be one of those fights where either they're going to be standing and trading, or Spivak's going to try to wrestle him, and we're going to see him have to go against a really good jiu-jitsu guy on the ground. So that covers it for that card, and covers it for my UFC coverage for the week. So last couple things to talk about are going to be wrestling and then jiu-jitsu. So for wrestling, a really big story with Pat Downey. So on July 25th, and I'll be previewing this card on next Sunday's podcast. Flow Wrestling is bringing in a lot of top wrestlers and putting together a card of their own. So on Flow Grappling, they've done a lot of cards that they've streamed with Fight to Win, and some other promotions like Coast Grappling. They've also started getting it from running some of them themselves and putting on their own events, like Who's Number One. So it seems like they're going to be doing that with wrestling here too. They've done some other events like that in the past, like Who's Number One was initially a wrestling event that they did with high school wrestlers, but now they're going to be bringing in some of the top senior level wrestlers. And I think the actual main event is going to be Kyle Dake versus Frank Chamizo, but at least domestically, the most interesting America versus America match is going to be between David Taylor and Pat Downey. It's a match that a lot of people had wanted to see for a while, and it looks like we're finally going to get it next Saturday. And by next Saturday, I mean the 25th, not the 18th. And so there's been a lot of hype around that match, a lot of talk about it. But in addition to that being on the top of the card, Flo has also been putting forth a lot of effort in terms of filling out the rest of the card and getting some other good matches on it. And they'd reached out to a couple of the top women's freestyle wrestlers and tried to get them on the card. And in doing so, they offered decent money. I think like they were offering to pay like $1,000 to the wrestlers to take a match there, which for women's wrestling, $1,000 for a match is really good money. I mean, even for like women's jiu-jitsu, $1,000 isn't really all that bad for some of the better girls in the world. But that was the offer that was made, and a handful of them turned down those offers and were public about doing so, and they were frustrated that they felt like the money wasn't enough for them. Again, it's not as though women's wrestling is a sport where they make a ton of money anyway. They also do other competitions like international tournaments that aren't like Olympic trials or aren't actually like the Olympics or World Championships that pay them less. So it's kind of odd that they were like saying, "Oh, well, I'm gonna get paid $1,000 and risk an opportunity to make $250,000 if I get a gold medal." That's referring to like the Living the Dream fund that they have for the Olympics, where pretty much regardless of sport, they'll pay you $250,000 if you get a gold medal in the Olympics for Team USA. So I guess that was like an argument they were making. But it seems that there was a lot of frustration for them that they felt that they should be paid the same as the men. And Pat Downey, who has been pretty outspoken pretty much forever, put up a tweet pretty much saying like, "Look, I enjoy watching women's wrestling, but if we're going to be honest here, most fans don't. They don't draw the same as the men. They don't bring in the same kind of money as the men, so it's really no surprise that like the women wrestlers were not offered as much as the men here on this card." And just a lot of people in the wrestling community tore him apart for it. I think a lot of people agree with him, myself included. I don't think he was wrong, because his point was just that the women's wrestling doesn't draw the same as the men's. That's pretty inarguable. I mean, you look at the NCAA championships every year for wrestling, they're able to fill entire stadiums. I mean, even for this year, they were moving to a football stadium just because of how many people end up coming into like the hockey/basketball stadiums. You never see anything like that for women's wrestling. In terms of internet traffic, articles that are about some of the top men in the world, whether it's Jordan Burroughs, Kyle Dake, and some of the other top wrestlers. They do a lot better when you're talking about like the top women's wrestlers in the world. So the point that he made was true. It's just that a lot of people, for whatever reason, they turn it into like a gender thing, and they want to make a big issue out of it when there really isn't a big issue there, even though what he was saying was true. And so it's kind of like, oh, well, you're being misogynistic, and oh, if you really want to grow the sport of wrestling, why put down the women like this? When in reality, he's just like stating a fact. It's not as though it puts down women. And the thing with growing wrestling, it's not as though you need to have women's wrestling for wrestling as a sport to grow. If you look at some of the top sports in the world, you look at football, for example, there is no real competitive women's football league that people give a crap about, and football is huge. Basketball, I mean, the WNBA exists, but no one really ever goes to those things. For hockey, they're trying to make some women's hockey leagues, but they can barely pay these athletes like a decent wage just because there isn't enough money that they're able to generate from it. So a lot of really big sports don't need to have like a really strong competitive women's ladder as well for them to be successful. With that being said, do I think that women's wrestling can be popular? Absolutely. We've seen other women's combat sports that are pretty popular. Women's jiu-jitsu seems to be growing a good amount. Obviously, women's MMA is pretty big. So women's wrestling can definitely be a thing. It can definitely be a successful thing. It can definitely grow pretty well. And it can help the sport as a whole. It's not as though having a good women's wrestling ladder would hurt wrestling as a whole. But it's not as though it's like a complete need either, where like wrestling couldn't survive without it. So there were a lot of people who were talking about how like completely necessary it is to have women's wrestling, and how saying that they draw in less than the men is somehow hurting them or whatever. I just think a lot of that sort of felt like virtue signaling. I think the worst part about this is that Pat Downey, who trains at New Jersey Regional Training Center, part of training there is that they'll give you a stipend and some money there to train there as well. He was effectively fired. The stipend was cut, and he was removed from their roster there over that statement that women's wrestling doesn't draw like men's wrestling, and people don't care as much, and so they probably shouldn't make as much. Pretty ridiculous that he's getting cut over that. And in response to that, one of the tweets that he put up was like, God, I'm done with wrestling. Wrestling's a dying sport. I'll be fighting as soon as all this is over. And I think what he's referring to is that his plan was probably to take a run at the Olympics this year, before the Olympics obviously got pushed back a year. If he makes it, then great. He'll run through the Olympic cycle and try to win a gold medal. If not, then he'll move on to MMA. I think the plan for him is he's still going to try to make the next Olympic team, which should be 2021. The guy who he's going to have to beat to do it is going to be the guy he's facing on July 25th. Obviously, whether or not he wins on July 25th isn't going to change anything for him. He still has to go through the Olympic trial process and face David Taylor then, assuming that he gets to David Taylor. But it seems like for him, he's really starting to sour even more in wrestling, especially after this, and it's going to push him into MMA really quick, which is a good thing for MMA in that this is a really outspoken guy. He's a very entertaining guy. He's one of those guys who you want to have a camera in front of him at all times. You want to hear what he has to say. Fantastic wrestling. So at least from a technique standpoint, he's going to be able to bring that with him. His jiu-jitsu, it's sort of hard to really gauge where that's at right now. He did have that match with Gordon Ryan where he lost by like a quarter Nelson, which was sort of odd. But again, Gordon Ryan's the best guy in the world. So for him to lose to Gordon Ryan, that doesn't really tell you much about where his jiu-jitsu stands against most normal opponents. I don't know what his striking is like, but either way, very good wrestling, very good personality, very marketable. So if he's going to be getting into MMA and doing so within the next year or so, that's definitely going to be good for the sport of MMA. It kind of sucks for wrestling. I think they're going to lose a really good personality like him, but I think for him the plan is to move to MMA pretty soon anyway, and getting fired from his role with the Regional Training Center over not really saying anything that wasn't true, I think that's going to push him in that direction as well. All right, last topic to talk about is going to be Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the third Coast Grappling Kumite. There were some really good matches on this one. So the first round matchup was between Roberto Jimenez and Nick Rodriguez. This was interesting in that the ref was very aggressive about calling stalling on Nick Rodriguez. I've talked about this in the past with Nick Rodriguez, where he likes to sort of just like stay on the outside for the most part and sort of pick his spots when he wants to explode. Just because from a jiu-jitsu technique standpoint, he's just not at the same level as a lot of these top guys in the world. But he can avoid a lot of their best positions. Force the fight into his best positions, whether that's wrestling on the feet or whether that's just forcing a couple scrambles where he's able to get to the back. And in doing that, he's had a lot of success to this point. Was able to get an early takedown on Jimenez, but over the course of the rest of the regulation there, he just was getting called for stalling over and over. Eventually lost a couple points for stalling. So they're tied heading into the overtime period from there. From there, Roberto Jimenez pulled guard, made sure that Rodriguez couldn't get any points for a takedown, and then from there was just a lot more aggressive and ended up getting a decision win there. Next match was Cyborg Abreu. I'm trying to remember who he faced off against. But Cyborg was able to get the win there. Let me see if I can pull it up right now. But either way, Cyborg, a lot of people had expected that Cyborg was going to end up facing Nick Rodriguez here. I think a lot of people expected that Nick Rodriguez would win against Roberto Jimenez. Big part of the reason why is that Rodriguez, let me shut that off, is that Nick Rodriguez was a lot bigger than Roberto, and a lot of people thought that Nick Rodriguez would be able to effectively use that game plan of just keeping it on the feet, getting a couple points here and there for a takedown. And the explosions that he has when he does go for offense tend to really stick in your mind, so I think a lot of people expected that would be enough for him. Ultimately, it wasn't, so he lost, so we didn't get that third match between Rodriguez and Cyborg that a lot of people wanted to see. And to an extent, that might have been pretty beneficial for Cyborg as well, because had he been forced to go against Nick Rodriguez, that's a tough matchup for him stylistically, and it would have made this tournament probably a lot tougher for him. But in his first round, he had a match with Arnaldo Maidana, was able to get the win there. On the other half of the bracket, first round match between Felipe Andrew and Lucas Barboza. I think a lot of people expected Barboza to run through this half of the bracket. Not that Felipe Andrew's an easy guy to beat, but Andrew's got a few moves that he's particularly good at. One of them is a triangle, where he'll kind of have like a really lazy setup to it, or at least it appears lazy, where he's not really like attacking right away. He'll just kind of like set it up and then all of a sudden like just snap that triangle on really quickly. Was able to hit it on Barboza, which is kind of surprising because Barboza has just a fantastic top game, very difficult to deal with. Just had a match with Rafael Lovato a couple weeks ago where Lovato just couldn't do anything to Barboza while Barboza was on top. Barboza eventually passed Lovato's guard and armbarred him. But here Andrew was able to snap on that triangle really quick, switch over to an armbar from that triangle position and get the tap. So big upset win for him. And then the last fight in the first round was Gabriel Almeida versus Guillermo Augusto, and Almeida was able to get the win there. Then the match between Jimenez and Abreu. Abreu was having a lot of success against Jimenez on the feet with his wrestling. Hit a couple takedowns on Roberto Jimenez, was able to win the regulation period, but in third coast, even if you win that period, if you don't get a tech fall, they'll send you to overtime. But winning it just kind of gives you the edge in terms of picking where the match goes from there. But then again, in overtime, the much bigger Abreu was able to use his weight effectively against Jimenez. Was attempting multiple takedowns, got pretty close on a couple, and ultimately that was enough for him to get the decision to move on to the finals. Then with the match between Felipe Andrew and Gabriel Almeida, I'm not exactly sure if Andrew caught the submission or not, just because it happened so quickly. But either way, Almeida appeared to injure his leg, and so he was out of that match. So then from there, Felipe Andrew moved on to the finals, and then we had the match between Andrew and Cyborg Abreu. And Abreu was able to catch a guillotine pretty quickly on him, and get a standing guillotine finish to win the tournament and win $10,000. So a lot of good matches that we had here. There were some really good matches that we missed out on. Not as though we got bad matches in their place. I think a lot of people did want to see the Nick Rodriguez versus Cyborg rematch, or their third match between the two of them. Jimenez was able to break that match up, but getting a Roberto Jimenez versus Cyborg Abreu match is still a really fun match regardless. So some really good jiu-jitsu there. There was also a really weird Royal Rumble type of match that they had with a bunch of kids, where they had like 8 different kids that would come in, where it'd be like every 1 minute a third kid would come in, so then you'd have like 2 guys grappling and one other guy just kind of watching. Then if you wanted to, you could try to choke the other guy who was like busy with his opponent. It's kind of bizarre, where a couple times you'd see a kid like pass his opponent's guard, and then while he was on top of side control, another kid would like jump in, take his back, and like choke him out. And it was kind of bizarre. They were using like actual WWE theme songs. Just a really weird thing to watch. I don't think it's going to be something that's going to become big in jiu-jitsu. I don't think that we're going to see a lot of adults do it either, but it was a fun little thing that they tried out, and I guess it was worth mentioning that just because of how fun it was. So that covers it for this week. I will likely be doing a recap on Wednesday night for the card that we're going to have on Wednesday. That's going to be headlined by Qatar and Ige. And then from there, I'll also have another podcast, which should be 68, assuming that I do 67 midweek next Saturday, which will be recapping hopefully a flyweight title fight and the rest of that card as well. So look forward to that, and hopefully the fights that we have over this week are going to be pretty good. Obviously, we've got a pretty good card on Wednesday, and let's hope for the best from that.